Yeah, so this should be very informal, so if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand or yell at me and stop. So our team, so this is the Wake Forest University HITS team. So this is the group of individuals that have been working on this project for the last several years. We've actually started talking about this, Joel and I did, back in 2009, and it's just over the years of talk and gathering money and people and energy, we've been able to amass this group of people. Now really, there are a lot of people here, but the two main workhorses are right here, and they're over here. So they really are the brains and the brawn behind this project. So we chose football because it's a deliberate contact sport. Players participate in a game that involves contact and involves contact with the head, and there's a helmet. So what other sport could we use in which we're looking at head injury? Does anybody have any ideas? Soccer's one, yeah, so people, but we don't really wear a helmet. What's that? Cheerleading, but again, hopefully it's not deliberate contact, but sometimes it is. Hockey, yeah. So really the two best sports that have been looked at or that have really been used to evaluate head injury have been hockey and football, and mainly it's because of the contact and also because of the helmet. The helmet allows us to put different devices in it to measure things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And so our motivation is several. My personal motivation is that I have kids, and my kids play football. They play other sports, but they play football. Two of my sons do. And we have data on older individuals, and we'll talk a little bit about this, Joel will, but really we don't have a whole lot of data as to what happens to the brain when it's injured as the brain is growing and developing. And so we certainly have plenty of subject material here. You can see it's orders of magnitude higher than the number of people that are playing in the NCAA, and that's across all divisions. And then, of course, the one that we all think about, and the one that many of you probably watched yesterday, is the NFL. And so what is a concussion? I'll give you this is actually going to be my last year speaking at this conference. So last year, before this conference, my son had a mild head injury. And then yesterday, my daughter did. So I'm done with it. If you guys were here last year, I talked about my son getting hit on the football field, and he had a really pretty violent hit that kind of brought me to my feet, and I ran out on the field and checked on him. But he didn't have a concussion. I don't know if any of you remember that story that I told, but he was hit. He had a headache. And that was it. And he had a headache for several days. Now, I treated him like he had a concussion, but just having a headache alone doesn't mean he had a concussion. Now, my daughter was climbing a tree yesterday and grabbed onto a rotten branch and fell. And she broke her wrist. But she stayed home from school today. And she didn't stay home from school today for the broken wrist, but she stayed home from school today because she didn't remember falling. She slept most of the day yesterday, and this morning when she got up, she was really dizzy. And so my son, who took this very violent hit from somebody who came from his blind side and nearly took his head off, I told him, "You're all right, you don't have a concussion," yet my daughter is staying home from a fall out of a tree. What's the difference there? Anybody know? Anybody want to? Because this term, I'll just tell you, this term is thrown around a lot, right? And I'll tell you, most people, even guys who I work with, say, "I don't really know what a concussion is." Where they say, this is a concussion, this isn't. And so we all want to use the same kind of rules as to when we want to say something is and isn't. Does a headache alone constitute a concussion? No. And that's you have to really be focused in when you talk to people about this. And really the thing that we want to look for are neurological symptoms, right? So loss of consciousness, dizziness, forgetfulness, blurry vision, amnesia, behavioral changes, any of those things. But this alone, just a headache after bumping your head, does not constitute a concussion. And we certainly have modifiers. There's, it affects the sleep. There can be prolonged loss of consciousness or amnesia. My daughter still doesn't remember falling out of the tree. There can be, these things can last a particular period of time. I've got some patients who had the exact same injury, or it seemed like they had the same injury. One has symptoms for 3 months, the other has symptoms for 3 hours. We don't know. And really, I think probably what I did in the last 5 minutes is confuse you even more about a concussion. So here are your take-home points. Number one, you have to have neurological symptoms to diagnose that. Okay, headache is obviously most common in these things, but we have to have neurological symptoms. So like I said, loss of consciousness, forgetfulness, blurry vision, inability to concentrate, inability to sleep, prolonged depression, any of those things. And the reason why we want to be specific on this is that a concussion implies that the brain has been injured, right? The problem is, though, a concussion by definition is something that we don't really have any objective data to say that that person had a concussion. So the MRI is negative, meaning it looks normal. The CAT scan is negative, meaning it looks normal. And so you're really basing it off of the clinical exam. And so that's why we really want to be specific on identifying these. And why we want to identify these is this thing that's come up a lot lately in the last 2 years in the lay press, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Has anybody not heard of CTE? It's been all over the lay press. A lot of I don't say a lot of NFL players, thankfully not a lot, but several high-profile NFL players have been diagnosed with this after they have died, typically in their 40s or 50s. Several have committed suicide, several have just gone and exhibited really bizarre behaviors right before they do die. And we think it's from this chronic exposure to multiple concussions over years. We don't know what the exact timeline is, nor do we know kind of what the exact inciting events, but we do know that most of these people played in the NFL, and then we have had some CTE diagnosed. It's currently only diagnosed post-mortem, so after the patient dies, we do an autopsy and stain the brain, and we identify these tau proteins in different parts of the brain. But we think that it is a result of long-term exposure to chronic hits. However, it has been diagnosed in college freshmen. And so here is our study, just a quick schematic. And we'll go more into it, but the participants involved were several teams, 3 youth teams in Blacksburg, Virginia, and 3 youth teams here in Winston-Salem. And we tried to capture really this whole continuum of kid all the way up to adolescence. And we know that the brain is maturing at a great rate during that period. And the brain goes through unbelievable just changes and networking changes in terms of the connections between the neurons and blood flow changes, and what does subjecting a brain that's undergoing that to football? What does that mean? We don't even know what that means just in general, just normal maturation. We've got a few ideas, but in truth, we don't really know what's going on. So studying this population has proved to be pretty insightful. And so our teams here have been, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the youth football here in town, but we've partnered with the South Fork Panthers and Reagan High School. And so we've tried to capture the aging brain through these years. So we place accelerometers in the helmets of all of our players, and we collect every single hit from the beginning of the season to the end, practice and games. And then we perform preseason and postseason cognitive testing and imaging. And the imaging is not the imaging that if you had a headache and you went to your doctor and they ordered an MRI, you go, this is a research type study. Because again, when I've given this talk before, they say, well, if you have a concussion, the MRI is normal, right? Well, it is, but what we're doing is a different type of MRI. And we can talk a little bit more into that. And so we get these preseason and postseason, we look at the changes over the course of the season. And we try to correlate those with the amount of hits and the amount of force that the patient's brain has been exposed to through the course of a season. Because every kid is different, right? Every kid has seen, some kids play a lot, some kids play little, some kids play positions where they're exposed to a high frequency but low force hits, and some kids are exposed to, you know, an occasional hit, but when they do hit, it's pretty high force. Here's an MRI machine. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The structural scans, so an MRI gives us data with regards to white and gray matter, and when I look at a scan clinically, so if I'm looking at someone with a brain tumor or some structural lesion, you know, trauma, that's what I'm looking at is looking at the white and gray matter and see if anything's distorted. What we're looking at with our study is more function, and looking at it at actually a little deeper level that's not used clinically. The magnetoencephalogram is another tool that we have here in Winston-Salem and at Wake Forest. You can think of it as kind of like a three-dimensional EEG. It gives us data on the connectivity of the gray matter, and so we're looking at perturbations over the course of a season after these kids have been hit through a season of football. And in the cognitive testing, we put these kids through a battery of tests, and allows us to look at memory and reaction time and things like that. Here is a picture of the actual accelerometer units. So this stays on the sideline, and we've got a booth over in the corner. The accelerometers sit in the crown of the helmet, and the way that they work is that when the skull moves within the confines of the helmet, it triggers, these accelerometers are sitting in the crown, and that is directly correlatable to, I think I just made up that word, is directly correlated to the movement of the brain within the skull. And so you can see that here. After the course of a season, or even a game or a practice, we can go back and look at each individual player and look at the directionality of each hit and also the force. And so you can imagine for each player we can put a season's worth of data up, and I think we have a schematic of that too. And so we have the sideline unit, we've got the players that are each instrumented, and then here's just an example of a hit that was in a collegiate football game that resulted in a concussion. And so with each hit, you know, we can go back to video data. We can, you know, every single play, every single hit in practice can be measured, and that's what is in fact done. And so we can identify specific injuries with specific plays. So here's a. So you can see this one of the players here that was hit in that. And he had a peak G of 72.5, which Joel can speak better to the forces of gravity. So that's a pretty amazing hit in terms of just forces imparted on that child, you know. And so these are two children that are playing really a game that can be pretty violent, and they're generating forces that are seen typically in college and pro levels. And so Joel's going to go a little bit more into the details of what we've gathered, what we've kind of figured out to this point, what questions we've now have uncovered that we're going to try to look at. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Are you going to do a long-term follow-up on the kids that were injured, or just cut it off at the end of their playing year?
So follow the kids who are injured?
Yeah.
Well, ideally we could follow.
Cognitively.
Yeah, so that's part of it. I mean, that's part of just their normal treatment. So the kids that are identified that have had injuries. So they're, taken care of, obviously, like, within, but unfortunately.
But you won't include the data in your study is what I'm asking. You won't follow longitudinally?
So when we leave, if everyone can donate money to the table at the back, ideally we'd like to follow these kids into adulthood. I mean, if we, what would be great in a perfect world if we had, money growing trees, we would get these kids that are playing at 7 years old and instrument them all the way through high school. And then we could, that would be fantastic. And that's our goal, but we're kind of running out of money. Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for being here today. I'm really happy to be here to chat with you. Actually, Alex, a great place to start would be to kind of segue and talk about G's real quick, because you're going to see a lot of G's in just a minute. We look at acceleration, which is kind of, if we're all sitting here in Earth's gravity at 1G, so we call that 1G. And so I won't tell you how much I weigh, but it's about 200 pounds, well north of 200 pounds. If I experience 10 Gs, a good kind of rule of thumb to remember, if I experience 10 Gs momentarily, I'll weigh about 2,000 pounds. We know that I can withstand that for a short period of time. The hits that we'll see in football, the mean that correlates with a concussion is 100 Gs. So I'm going to weigh, 10 times 2,000 pounds, 20,000 pounds at 100 Gs for a very short duration. So those types of forces can create a lot of deformation. So they can create the reason why we show that picture of the skull and then the helmet and then the skull within the helmet and the brain within the skull is that we're applying this high G level to the skull, and the brain is, it's kind of a captive within the skull, and it's experiencing these really high G levels for really short durations. All right, it's kind of what we do for a living in automobile safety. We study short duration, really high level loading, and those are the impacts that we're interested in doing. So if you experience 100 Gs for a long period of time, I can tell you without equivocating, you won't survive. The 100 Gs at a few milliseconds, really short. When you blink your eyes, it's about 15 milliseconds. Those types of impacts are survivable because they're associated with smaller motion, smaller deformation. But anyway, that gives you an idea what I'm talking about when I said 10 Gs, a ton. I would weigh a ton, and 100 Gs. So over the past 10 years, Virginia Tech has really kind of started this work, collecting data in football players. And through the development of the system that we now collect our data with, they've collected well over 1 million impacts, actually, is where they are right now. Many concussions. We're going to talk a little bit about different directions of impact. There are many colleges that are playing collegiate football and have put this system in their collegiate football players that you see at the bottom there. So what we did, this youth study, is really the first time that someone has gone in and instrumented kids that are headed on their way to college. So that's the data we're showing you. And the question that we always get is, does one position have more impacts than another? Some of the CTE slide that you saw before from Dr. Powers, it discussed how about 40% of cases with CTE have been diagnosed in linemen, kind of the position, the people playing there in a line. If you watch football, you notice those guys are hitting every play, right? They're hitting each other every single play. A lot of low-level, what we call subconcussive, below the level of when you're 90% likely or 100% likely to get a concussion, but they're experiencing those hits the majority of their life, right? So they're getting lots and lots of low-level impacts. And that's a pretty key thing to understand about our study, because we're going to talk a lot about studying subconcussive impacts and studying that cumulative effect of all the impacts that someone experiences. That is the goal of what we've done from a research perspective. And the reason we want to study this in our field, auto safety, military, sports, biomechanics is this application. We know a lot about adults. We know a great deal about adults and how they get injured, but I think everybody here understands, just as I do, you understand better than I do, that children are not little adults, right? So we follow the same mantra in vehicle safety and injury safety. We understand that very well. This is about understanding the tolerance of kids to head injury. We have lots of head impacts. So we have this adult data in collegiate football players. This has led to, in our field, improved injury criteria. And I heard someone talking before about a pedestrian impact. Better understanding of what's going to happen to a kid in a pedestrian impact when they're hit by a car. We know a lot about what's going to happen to an adult. We have great dummies for the adults. We have great injury criteria for adults to say when an adult's going to get a particular injury. We don't have a lot of information about kids, so we view this as kind of one step on the way to understanding kids better. And also to evaluate helmet safety is one of the main impacts for this, to look at helmet safety in kids. So we need data for child-specific injury criteria. In order to make better equipment, you need to know more about how people are getting injured. That's kind of the mantra of this equipment design. You need dummies of kids. We need crash test dummies. We call them anthropomorphic test devices. There are ones that represent the kids, but even if you have a dummy that's the shape and the size of a kid, what are you going to use that dummy to predict? What's the underlying science of how that dummy is going to tell you whether a kid's going to get a concussion or a head injury in a car crash, or whether they're going to be well restrained in a booster seat in a vehicle? We need better criteria for the abdomen. Many of you are familiar with abdominal injuries that kids get in car crashes. We need better criteria for the lower extremity. We need better criteria for the neck. We need better criteria for the head, for the brain. And so this research in particular will help us establish better criteria for the brain and for predicting mild concussive brain injury. The data that we've collected, and again, as Dr. Powers discussed in conjunction with Virginia Tech, over the last season, collected almost 3,000 impacts from 6 to 8-year-olds, 12,000 impacts because we've actually got 3 teams in this age range, or 2 teams in this age range, 50 players, 10 players at the middle school level, and 40 players at the high school level, which are all here. And you can see all the impacts that we've collected from 3,000 to 12 to 3,000 to 16,000 impacts. We look at the 50th percentile, or kind of the mean impact that those people sustained, around 20 Gs. Okay, so that's me at 200 pounds, weighing 4,000 pounds for a short period of time. That's the type of G levels that we're talking about. That's just the median. But the 95th percentile, kind of the top level of impacts that these kids are experiencing, 36, 46, 60, 58 Gs. So, really about triple what you are in the mean. So that's equivalent to me weighing 6,000, 7,000 pounds. So you have 111 kids under 18 years old, about 35,000 impacts, and over that time in the first season, about 8 diagnosed concussions. A lot of exposure data, right? Like all those impacts that we've collected, 35,000 impacts, all represent to me mostly subconcussive exposure. So kids have not gotten a concussion with 34,600 of those impacts that we've diagnosed. Only 8 of them have received a concussion. So we're going to talk a lot about that. That cumulative exposure is what we're trying to study with this study. This is a game impact. A lot of this game video, as opposed to the concussion video that we showed you before, these are impacts sustained by players primarily in Virginia. And this is going to continue to run. So this is the kid on the bottom, kind of on the right side, experiencing a 20 to 30 G impact. So maybe nothing out of the ordinary there that you would see during a regular football game. This is a 30 or 40 G impact, very short. Again, these are very short durations. Not all these impacts resulting in concussions.
Hey,
So you can see that if in several football games you've seen players leading with their head. In the NFL, they're learning not to do this, right? This is and he's fine, but he did just sustain a 30 to 40 G impact. We look at games versus practices quite a bit. What sort of practice routines do kids have, and how much do they expose themselves to impacts during practice versus games, and what are the magnitudes of those impacts that they experience during practices versus games? So this is a 50 G impact, and this one should run also. They're taught to help each other up, which I think is very good sportsmanship. Watch that one more time. So I'm not here to talk about, to weigh in on whether I think these are good or bad. I think the research that we're doing is good. I will say, before we had this picture, this video of this, one of the things I've done is go out on YouTube and look up, impacts, and that's an unfortunate thing to do. If you go look for impacts on YouTube, at the youth level, I mean, kids taking some really bad impacts and then crying and and this sort of thing, and so that it's a similar scenario there, but that there was nothing abnormal about that drill. We've instrumented our kids. There's about 20 at the junior Pee Wee level. Those are kids from about 9 to 11. About 17 to 20 from the Pee Wee level, which is about 10 to 12 years of age. And then Reagan High School, which we had 40 instrumented. We look at just at those three teams, the median impact and the 95th percentile impact, you'll see. So we always kind of look at these in terms of a plot. Kind of the acceleration level versus the number of impacts that people sustain. And these follow this kind of like bright skewed kind of bell curve, where the 50th percentile is up here. That's the most common level of impact. The 95th percentile is only about 5% of the impacts are exceeding that level. And there's a pretty substantial difference. So that the medians are pretty close in these different age groups. And this is a pretty substantial jump from late, 11, 12 years old up to 16 to 18 in high school. But the medians are pretty similar to each other. The 95th percentiles have a much larger variation. So we're going from a little bit less than 50 to closer to 60. And we'll look at this acceleration. One of the things you can do is you can take this plot here, and you can basically sum it up and do a cumulative exposure. And I think the key thing to take away from this is we look at these two populations of the junior Pee Wee and Pee Wee kids are all in red here. So in general, their curves, their 50th percentile G level is here. Their 95th percentile G level is up here. And so you see where those are. They're not really that different, like we talked about. When you start to get up to the 95th percentile, there starts to get it to be a little bit larger variation. The other, I think, striking finding of our study is that there's tremendous interplayer variability in these. So you can look at a mean curve for a team or at a particular age level all day, and you can see that they're pretty close. And you could look at these and say, well, they're pretty close. But you do see here a lot of kids well below that are the red, the younger kids, and a lot of kids on the high school team. And some of these guys are college and NFL prospects on the high school team, actually. Some of them that are hitting harder, you would really actually be able to pick these people out. But some of these kids have a 50th percentile impact of 40, 35 Gs, 30 to 40 Gs here. I mean, they're hitting almost twice as hard as some of the other kids on the team. So that's this blue distribution. So you do have a lot more of these outliers. These kids are just, when they're hitting a lot harder than other kids are. And what they're experiencing over the course of a game or they're getting hit a lot harder than other kids are. It's not really, we're not able to say with our research most of the time whether you're the hitter or the hittee. You're sort of, so maybe they're not all, maybe I should take back something I said, they're not all college prospects, maybe some of them, or maybe, maybe I'd venture to say maybe they shouldn't be out there, right? If they're getting hit too much, or they're more risk than other players are. So, but in general, we see higher hits at the high school level. So if you just look at the average curve there, you can see that in general it's shifted to the right. And on average, looking at these practice versus game, we get about average 10 hits per practice, 10 hits per game in the junior Pee-wees. A little bit over that, more hits per practice in Pee-wee and 10 hits per game in the Pee-wees, and 9 hits per practice and 16 hits per game in the high school. So that the kids are hitting more in games than they are in practice at the high school level, whereas they're actually hitting more at the lower levels, at Pee-wee level, during practice than they are in games. And that's another pretty striking finding. It means that we can have a big impact on the type of head impact exposure that kids get over the course of a season by changing practice. I mean, we can in some cases here reduce it by 50%. We can look at things like where the kids are getting hit in the different locations, because we have this data that Alex spoke about. For a single subject, we can look at the majority of hits taking place to the front of the helmet versus the top of the helmet, that sort of information. What we're interested in is cumulative exposure, though. So it's a cumulative risk assessment is a tool for looking at harmful effects over time. So when we talk about that lineman who developed CTE, we're interested in studying the cumulative effect of exposure. If we look here at Will Farrell on the left side, he's had a bad sunburn. What's her name? Edna? Magda. She is spending too much time tanning, so she's exposing herself to the sun every day over a long period of time. So this is our person who got a concussion. This is our person who's getting exposed to multiple low-level impacts over the course of a lifetime. One concussion, multiple low-level impacts. All right. So if you ever need to. So what does this mean for us, for our research? If you recall this CTE, one of the things that's suggested is that this multiple low-level exposure impacts occurring on every play may be the bigger overall risk over the course of a lifetime than single high-level concussive blows that players are receiving. And what we'll do is we'll look at this exposure. Like I was saying before, if you take home kind of one thing today, it's this focus on exposure versus the concussion, because this is what you see if you watch the NFL. You see it every day. It's this person was concussed, they're not playing the rest of this game. They were concussed, they're not playing for the next 2 games. And I play fantasy football. When someone gets a concussion, I don't know when they're going to come back now. It's 2 to 3 games, maybe they're going to be out sometimes. Some of them are coming back the next week, and someone's making that decision. But we're interested in the exposure, and to know about the risk to a player, you have to understand the exposure, all the number of impacts that they receive. That's 30, 50,000 for all our teams over the course of a season. And the numerator here is the injury incidence. The number of concussions is the number of concussions that all those people sustain. So the risk might actually be very low for a given impact, right? But it adds up over time. And we have, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about these, but we know that if you take all the impacts people sustain and you plot them along an axis, so all the non-injury impacts here, let's say, and the few injury impacts here, we can fit these with a curve that's basically a risk curve. And we can say that if you're looking at linear acceleration, one particular type of impact direction, a 50th percentile impact needs to be at around 175 Gs in order for it to have, or 50% risk is about 175 Gs, right? But you know as well as I do at this point that you can have 75 G hit that results in a concussion, and you can have 125 G hit that doesn't result in a concussion. So this risk is really key to understanding what the exposure is. How much risk have you been exposed to over the course of your game or your season or your practice or your lifetime? And we can also look at this in terms of rotational. So I won't spend a lot of time on linear versus rotational, but it's kind of, to use a baseball analogy to describe football, it's kind of inside baseball. That the idea that you're moving in a linear direction or you're hit, the idea that you're rotating your head when you hit, those are thought to have different risks associated with them. And as engineers, we want to take into account both modes. So for me, it's the same as kind of looking at, well, this was a frontal impact in a vehicle and this was a side impact for a vehicle. Those are two different risks. And so anyway, we kind of look at different aspects, and that's just doing better science by doing that. And now there's newer risk curves, like the combined probability risk curve, that are for both of them. So we know someone has a particular linear acceleration here and a particular rotational acceleration. I'm not going to bother to try to come up with an analogy for rotational acceleration, but you know that there's a line of 25% risk or 90% risk, and it involves particular combinations of rotational and linear. Quantifying that risk is the goal for us. Like when you take this instrumented helmet data from hit impacts and you try to use it to say what sort of risk someone's been exposed to over the course of their game or their season or their lifetime, we want to know what those risks are. So we have many different tools at our disposal to do that. So we want to develop this metric. So we took every risk associated with every impact. So every impact that kid sustained over the course of a game or a season, you can take it up and you can come up with a risk, and you can come up with a risk associated with any of those different tools that I showed you, the linear or the rotational or the combined. And I don't think that's necessary to remember, but the idea is that you can take each one, that risk, and multiply it by the exposure. When we do this, so we take every impact and we multiply it by the risk and we add them all up. So if I had a 10G and a 50G and a 60G impact, each one of those will be multiplied by the risk associated with the impact, my risk of concussion, and I would add that up. And we come up with numbers that look like the number of concussions that someone might be exposed to over the course of a season cumulatively. And we can look at those in any of these different approaches, linear, rotational, combined. We can see that there's really substantial differences between the 7 to 8, 9 to 12, and the 12 to 14, and the 14 to 18. So whereas you saw that, that there was a particular different, the 50th percentiles were similar, the 95th percentile was somewhat different. When we sum up the risk, we take into account all the things that are important. How much did they play? How many times did they get hit? Were they practice versus games? Over the course of the season, what was the total exposure for the player? And we see statistically significant differences in these, and I won't spend a lot of time on that. But so this risk-weighted exposure is what we're calling it, is a tool that's an improved method for capturing that exposure in football players. And it's not applicable just to youth football. It's something that we've introduced and published for use with collegiate athletes, for use with NFL athletes, for use in other sports. Anywhere that you can measure the type of impact that people are experiencing, you can use this metric to quantify the overall subconcussive exposure over the course of whatever duration that you're interested in. So it successfully kind of captured this variability in age groups, and we found significantly lower cumulative exposure, and we also found the 12 to 14-year-olds are getting an exposure near to that of high school players, even though the level of physicality is not the same. So we'll talk about imaging here and kind of go through some of the imaging results. These are just a few slides here. If you think back to the MRI and the MEG, the magnetoencephalogram that Dr. Powers was talking about, I think a lot of people would agree with me. Taking that exposure metric and using it to try to interpret the changes that we find in medical images is one area that would be very interesting, to try to understand if there are changes in medical images due to this cumulative exposure over the course of a season. That would be a very interesting thing, a new thing that you could do. We couldn't do before without an exposure metric of some type. And so the pre and post-season imaging that we're doing is being done with Liz Davenport and our neuroradiology colleagues that do a lot of this type of research. And we take these kids who have all got an MRI or a magnetoencephalogram. We take that data and we look at it. We have, through the Answer Lab, which is run by our neuroradiology colleagues, kind of a processing pipeline for both MEG and MRI that we can look at these with. We look at things like connectivity network, and if there are questions about these, I'm going to refer them to Liz. But we can see both on fMRI and MEG changes from the beginning to the end of the season. We look at preliminary data from magnetoencephalogram, again, measuring the electrical activity, which is kind of a product of a metabolic impairment that results from getting a concussion, or having lots of that seems to result from getting lots of subconcussive exposure. We've actually seen variations in these from beginning to end of season that are, I think, yet still to be published and yet to be sort of peer reviewed and out there. But this is preliminary data that we've been working with. I think probably the thing that's closest to getting out there right now is looking at fractional anisotropy, which is, like Dr. Powers was saying, we can take a lot of different pictures, a lot of different research types of grade pictures with the MRI, and one of those is to look at diffusion tensor imaging. And our neuroradiologist colleagues, Answer Lab, they've come up with a measure of this, that how to quantify a particular area within the brain as abnormal versus preseason. So if they can find those, and we can correlate that volume or that information with the exposure. So here's a plot of head impact exposure in our players versus number of or abnormal voxels versus head impact exposure. This is really big news for us to find something like this, and we're kind of in the process of kind of putting that out there. So what we've learned from this, I hope I've been able to convince you it's worthwhile, the work that we've done. For us, I think it helps us just understand brain biomechanics and understand brain injury. Knowing the acceleration of the skull and the brain, like one of the things that we do as engineers is model these events. So we'll look at a model of the brain and how the acceleration makes the brain deform and how that might correlate with the location of imaging changes. Having a tool like that will allow us to make better vehicles. It'll allow us to make better safety equipment. It has applications to all the relevant motor vehicle safety standards. So 208 is the frontal standard. These are safety standards that we work on from a research standpoint, as well as computational modeling work that we do. And I think a couple of kind of take-home points for this research in general, because we get asked a lot of these types of questions. There are a lot of strategies that I think you can see that we touched upon in the research that we do today. Things like rule changes, changing where someone receives a kickoff, so you're limiting the maximum velocity that people can get through on special teams. Plays limits the overall exposure of players. Changing whether they're going to hit at practice changes the exposure, and that's something you have a lot of control over. And there are rule changes and those types of things, and we don't think that the only answer is making safer helmets. We think kind of a unified strategy here is important. Teaching technique, teaching that young kid who's hitting 50, 60 Gs by leading with his helmet, or the kid who's tackling them, teaching them that before they get to the point where they're starting to hit a lot harder and there's a lot more maybe risk associated with that impact. But we can also use this information to make better equipment. So if I have a really good understanding of when a concussion will occur and the rotational accelerations, the linear accelerations of impact that are associated with a concussion risk, I can use that information to limit those things in a way that will help prevent further concussions. And that's something that's already kind of come to fruition. There's a lot of debate about it, a lot of questions that everyone asks, but for a lot of different reasons. But we think this is kind of all these things are needed. Where this research tends to be focused, at least from my end, is the potential to have better design helmets and reduce the level of exposure that way. But there's also, I think you can see a potential for doing better diagnosis. right? Maybe there is an MRI you can get, or maybe there is a MEG that you can get to tell you more about what's going on with a concussion or when it's resolved. And those are applications. It's also been translated into a helmet rating system, and Virginia Tech actually kind of pioneered this by taking different helmets, the different helmets that are available from different manufacturers, and by dropping them. If you take a helmet and you drop it at 6 feet down to 1 foot, that actually encompasses 99+% of all the impacts that someone can sustain on a football field. So drop a helmet from 6 feet, it's about the hardest impact that you're going to get. The accelerations that are associated with that. And you can look at a helmet's ability to reduce or attenuate through padding and through coupling with the head, right? To attenuate those accelerations and to therefore reduce risk associated with a particular drop. And that's a real number that you can use to say, oh, this helmet is doing a better job of lowering the acceleration than this other helmet. And they've actually come up with these helmet ratings. And there are helmets that you can say based on cost to kind of safety, the helmet rating star number, that they are actually basically able to reduce the risk of concussion more than other helmets. And this has had a big impact. It's had a big impact on football helmet companies that make these helmets, who I think you can imagine have a really big financial investment in their products and I think want to see this research, but more than that, want to see their helmets doing well in these tests. And it's had a big impact on some school systems which have mandated the use of a 5-star helmet versus a 4-star helmet. Anyway, it's been kind of a bonanza for Virginia Tech, but I think we'll start to get into that, into this more with youth, I think, with some of our involvement in this. So do helmets work? Yes. They reduce the risk of concussion, but helmet data can be very, very improved. Helmets modulate this energy transfer to the head during impact, and helmets that reduce acceleration reduce the risk. And these linear rotational components are linked, and by reducing one, you kind of reduce the other. And we've got new data now to help us understand the type of risk associated with impacts in kids. And this reduction has been kind of experimentally and clinically verified. So this fall, which we've just finishing up, we've actually continued. There was a question about following these kids throughout their careers, or throughout their young careers and maybe longer in life. That first year, we instrumented the junior Pee-wee and the Pee-wee, and we are following those kids. So those junior Pee-wee kids who are playing at the Pee-wee level now, we're instrumenting them this season. The Pee-wee kids that moved to junior midget, we instrumented them this season, and we're continuing to follow those kids. So for some of those kids, it's a smaller number that are getting imaging and getting all the data for like two years. We're following them, and we also, I think our study has really improved the last couple of years. We've added different neurocognitive testing, imaging. This year, I'm particularly happy to say we sort of worked really hard with the Children's Institute for Pediatric Trauma and the Rockefeller Foundation to put an athletic trainer in the South Fork Panthers Youth League. So an athletic trainer on the sidelines of youth football, which is 3.5 million kids in the U.S. playing youth football, right, versus 2,000 playing at the NFL. Almost none of these youth football leagues have an athletic trainer present to do any basic stuff for these kids, which is a pretty amazing statistic. And I think we're one of the first ones to do this by helping to find the money to do that. So anyway, with that, I want to take questions for Alex and I both, and also thank the Children's Institute for Pediatric Trauma, who thus far has been our primary benefactor on this study and has helped us do the work I showed you today, as well as NHTSA and the Answer Lab. So thanks. BT is working on those actually. So my understanding is that they've actually got a team instrumented in hockey helmets are very different from football helmets and more difficult to get that type of data, but they're working on that. And I think that's actually maybe coming next 6 to 12 months.
I'm curious as to whether any individual families get feedback about their individual child's scores and if that's affected their decision making.
We have not to this point. But we have shared the data with them and talked to them about just the cumulative study, but we're not making any clinical decisions on what we're gathering, because we're just kind of measuring exposure. That's kind of the.
Once you study these kids from weekly to beyond, do you see the same kids, so you do progressive scans, so you see beginning of season, end of season, then you scan them again beginning of the next season, and has there been any change? Or any reversion of any concussion injuries?
So we're on season 2.
Okay.
And so that's something hopefully we'll be able to, after this season, go back and compare. And we can have the same kids do that.
Would you expect children to be about the same as adults when it comes to cumulative injury, or maybe more resistant to it because of younger?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So last year around this time, actually right at the end of summer, there was another neurosurgeon who wrote a book about sports and kids, and he just said, I don't think kids should participate in contact sports until they are 14. And he just picked that number out of the hat, and he got a lot of press out of the book. And that's something that there's zero data to support any of that, and we're trying to figure that out. Our kids, as the brain matures, and it doesn't mature at a linear rate, it changes, and we all know, or anybody that's been around teenagers, something's going on in their brain. They really are organically. There are things happening within the brain right at the 2 years of adolescence that is real. And so the brain has a capacity to repair itself. Does that capacity change during that period? Is it different before adolescence? Is it ramped up during adolescence, or is it ramped down? We don't know. And so we may get through this study and say, you know what, you really shouldn't play during the ages of 14 to 16, or you can't. I mean, just to arbitrarily say, okay, a 14-year-old you can play. I think it's kind of based on picking a number out of the air, and so we don't know that, and hopefully we'll be able to figure that out. Is the exposure, is a 7-year-old who's playing football, is that very safe? Them playing, and it may be. My prediction is that I'll just tell you, in my clinical practice, I think kids that get injured during that period of puberty, they tend to, they have a much broader range of symptoms. And so I think something is going on in that period obviously we know something's going on, but I think their ability to repair themselves is probably a little different. Anyone else?
What have you actually seen in the 8 that were concussions? Are there things with functional MRI and the before and after that maybe if they just showed up in an ED and got a scan, you wouldn't notice?
Yeah, so some of the, right, we haven't yet, but really the exciting stuff that Joel alluded to, that's actually, when I say exciting, this is like front page. We've really unlocked some key mysteries in the brain, which is, if we look at the kids who have been exposed the most, there's a metric that we look at on this, that DTI, which kind of looks at the integrity of the white matter. So the white matter is you can think of the cabling of the brain. The white matter changes over a course of a season, and that change is correlated to the amount of exposure of hits that kid has had. Okay, so think of it like, the more hits you have, the more changes you have to the brain, and those are real structural changes. And that's kind of scary to think about. And so the next question is, do those changes improve after a season off, or are those changes permanent? What are the implications of those changes? Are we laying the groundwork for CTE in the future? If they continue to be exposed to this. So that this is the first time that we've been able that anybody's been able to show that there are true anatomic. I'm not going to use the word injury, but there are changes within the brain that correlate with the amount of hits. So that's pretty cool.
Interested, you're mixing with the national sport, so I'm just kind of
No, but people ask that all the time. You know, are you trying to end football? Are you trying to, you know? Yeah, no, and the game needs to be changed. You know, just like we showed. You know, that if we can decrease the number of hits in a season, we actually, there's a paper published that looked at, you know, if we change practice patterns, does that change the quality of the game? And it doesn't. But that, you know, there are modifications that can be done to the game to make it safe and or safer. It's not necessarily a safe game. So, and this is, I'm sure that people here want to say, like, gosh, why do you let your kids play football? So I'll tell you why. One, because my kids like to play. Two, they're playing a game that's relatively safe given their age, even though they are exposed to potentially large hits. Three, the positions that they play. You know, the son that played this year, he's a quarterback, so he really doesn't see any hits at all, thankfully. And four, you know, when he gets to the high school level, I'm not going to let him play unless the game has changed. So that's, you know, I get that question a lot. Like why would you, you know, you see how, you know, you see that that football does change the brain. You know, I want to say that again. Football, you know, we've shown that, and so that's a big deal. You know, you're allowing your kid to be in a sport that would potentially injure them. But I have told them, you know, even though he loves it, my 12-year-old loves the game and is actually pretty good at it. But I've said, you know, unless there are like real changes and meaningful changes, you know, your days are done when you get to a certain age.
I think last year you talked some about like headbands for soccer players.
Mhm.
Have y'all gone any further with that?
No, I mean that was just people. You know, there are helmets for soccer players. They look like water polo helmets without the puffy ear things. But no, we haven't looked at. We certainly would if anybody wants to give money. We will.
You could demonstrate the changes on the MRI testing. Did you see correlating changes in their cognitive testing that matches their structural changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, not exactly. Not to the degree that we'd like. The cognitive testing piece is probably the weakest component of our test, and we're doing it more. We'd obviously like to have that strengthened, and we've added a new member to the team that is kind of increasing our ability to identify cognitive changes as well. That's if you look in the concussion world, the cognitive piece to everybody's study is probably in my opinion, the weakest, because you can look, you know, if you go into any subset analysis of subjects, you can find something that will change their ability to take these cognitive tests. So ADHD, IQ, socioeconomic background. I mean, all these things, they really muddy the waters in terms of being able to, you know, truly scientifically look at the groups. So that's a roundabout to say no, we didn't show anything.
I applaud what you're doing. As a mother of 6, I've had experience with head injury. My 29-year-old was hit by a car and got a right limbic system clot at 8 years old. And if you'd done cognitive testing then, he would have been normal. 2 years later, he showed up what the university finally diagnosed as head injury-induced ADD. And other area brain centers came dominant. In high school, he reverted back after intervention to full ability to be academically fine, and went to college and did fine. So I think in the age group where they're more concrete functioning until they move to higher cognitive centers, you're not going to see changes in cognitive right away in the younger set. So I totally applaud what you do, because I've seen long-term changes in him now at 29 years old.
Mm-hmm.
The trainer that y'all talked about, are they at practices or just at the games?
Yeah, they are. They come and they've been great. Is there a hand over here? Okay, I think.
Are you saying the hardest impact of the better athletes, or because their technique is better, are they more able to like have less impact?
Yeah, that's a. So there's several answers to that question. The harder impacts are seen in the kids who are probably better players. You know, certainly at the high school level, because they, I think, you know, Joel knows better than I do about this, but there was, I think, one particular player for Reagan that was kind of a college prospect, and he would, you know, in games or in big games, you know, his hits were significantly higher than during practice or some other time. And so, you know, you can imagine you can look at the implications of why he was hitting harder. And then also it's position specific. So, you know, linemen, large quantity of hits, but smaller forces, you know, but it's repetitive. More skilled position players are going to have the larger hit, you know, the dramatic hit that everybody goes, oh, you saw that, but they, you know, their volume of hits is going to be smaller. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you.